So, hi everyone, I'm Leanne, and today this presentation is on relationship diversity and specifically about customizing your connections. So what I want to emphasize at the start of this presentation is that this is not a talk specifically about polyamory and non-monogamy. Of course, I'm presenting from the lens of someone who is polyamorous. I have been non-monogamous since I was 17. I'm now 24. So, obviously, I'm going to be talking from that perspective. But mainly I want to talk about the diversity of relationship styles that exist. And that obviously includes, anything from kind of monogamy to polyamory and like whatever it is in between. And the aim of this presentation is to talk about various concepts kind of related to relationship diversity, and also talk about how monogamy and the normalization of monogamy, which is also known as mononormativity, how that has kind of influenced just the cultural psyche and just how we view relationships in general, and why kind of polyamorous and non-monogamous relationships have been marginalized. So yeah, it's going to be a bit of a kind of 101 on all kinds of relationships, but also grounding it in modern culture and how that has influenced all of us, because obviously we live in a mononormative society where polyamorous and non-monogamous relationships are just beginning to get some recognition, not just socially but also legally. So yeah, basically I encourage everyone to customize their connections according to whatever you and the people in the relationship actually want, rather than just doing what everyone else is doing. And not just with romantic connections, but with all connections, friendships, casual relationships, work, family, whatever. And yeah, ultimately it is about the diversity of human connection, and how all these types of connections play different roles in our lives, rather than just having the one true love romantic connection as the be all end all. So a little bit about me. So yeah, I'm Leanne. My pronouns are she, they. I am a polyamory educator and content creator. I run a page called Polyphilia. So you can find me on basically all of social media, a Polyphilia blog. And yeah, I started writing about my experiences just over 2 years ago. And that was during the pandemic, when I think a lot of people were coming to terms with various aspects of their lives that they hadn't taken the time to question. I know a lot of people realized that they were queer or trans or neurodivergent during the pandemic, and I think that non-monogamy getting more recognition these days is partly and due to the fact that yeah, people were stuck indoors thinking thoughts, and ultimately realized that they wanted to practice a different way of life and try new things. And so I kind of came in at a very interesting time, and so yeah, now I do this as my full-time job. I was actually a law student, but I gave up on a career in law and now pursue this full-time. So yeah, kind of I produce short form education and entertainment on polyamory and non-monogamy. And yeah, some of my content is silly videos, some of my stuff is advice, some of it is memes, try to kind of inject some levity into the conversation, rather than just writing really long articles that maybe people don't have the time to read. So yeah, so that's who I am. That's what I do. Also, personally, I am bisexual, polyamorous, obviously. I'm neurodivergent. I'm autistic, and I also have ADHD, so I talk about that on my platform as well. And I'm a person of color. So yeah, so that's a very brief intro. So yeah, so today I'm going to be talking about a couple of different topics. So firstly, I'm just going to do a run through of the relationship spectrum. So I think people typically kind of categorize relationships into it's monogamy, non-monogamy, and polyamory, and kind of that's it. But I want to demonstrate how it's not kind of discrete kind of categories or like a binary, but rather more like a spectrum, you know, like gender, like sexuality. So I'm going to be kind of talking about that and talking about like the different types of relationships that exist within that, but mainly demonstrating how like, yeah, there's a lot more fluidity and overlap between the relationship styles than most people would think at first glance. Then I'll be talking about like two different concepts called the relationship escalator and relationship anarchy. These may or may not be terms you're already familiar with. So kind of going into those topics and kind of talking about how they influence us kind of culturally. And then finally, I'm going to be talking about, you know, like legal recognition of like, you know, alternative relationships, how marriage rights kind of affect, you know, not just polyamorous people, but also kind of other different groups. How, you know, like I'm going to be talking about various misconceptions about non-monogamy and polyamory and where they came from, more importantly, and what those misconceptions reveal about like what society thinks about relationships in general. And yeah, and obviously, like I said, like you can ask me questions throughout. I will answer them best as I can. Please put them in the chat, and yeah, I'll just kind of like go through them in turn. So yeah, so broadly kind of three sections. Okay, so this is a diagram I made called the relationship spectrum. So so on the left, you have monogamy, which is what most people in the world practice. And monogamy is typically kind of defined as a relationship involving two people where they are romantically and sexually exclusive. Now, the boundaries of like what is determined as romantic and sexual are obviously up to the people in the relationship. And as I'm going to explain later, you know, yeah, like the boundaries around that are quite blurred, and they can be quite blurred depending on the relationship. But generally speaking, yeah, you know, two people agree to, you know, like be romantically and sexually involved with each other and each other only, and yeah, to forsake all others and you know, like not pursue any new connections with other people until they break up or until someone dies. And then so, you know, we have a dotted line that kind of separates monogamy from like other types of relationships. So everything that isn't monogamy is non-monogamy. I wish there was a better term that didn't kind of define it as like anything that is not monogamy. I mean, imagine if like homosexuality was just non-heterosexuality. But you know, this is the terminology that we have. Another term is open relationships, but open relationships, like the meaning of that has changed quite a lot in recent years. In the past, open relationships would be used to refer to like any relationship that was sexually and or romantically open. Whereas now I feel like there's a distinction between like an open relationship and polyamory, in that open relationships kind of describe what you see in the middle of the diagram, which is relationships that are romantically exclusive, but sexually non-exclusive. Whereas before, you know, they'd be expanded to include polyamory as well. Whereas now I think the definition's narrowed a bit, but some people do still use open relationships and open marriages, etc., to describe like all types of, you know, non-monogamous relationships. So that's why I've kind of put that at the top there as a general category. So within non-monogamy, there is a spectrum as well. So obviously, you know, like there are relationships that are sexually open, but romantically closed. There are relationships that are both sexually and romantically open. And in slightly rarer cases, there are relationships that are romantically open, but sexually closed. Depends on the individuals in the relationship. But, you know, from left to right, basically, like what I'm trying to emphasize is that, like, you know, there's a spectrum where on the left, I suppose there's more, there's less, I don't want to say like individual like autonomy, perhaps like individual agency, I suppose, like, you know, because of the agreement to forsake all others and be exclusive, you have a little bit less freedom in what you can and can't do with other people in a monogamous or kind of monogamish kind of relationship. Whereas on the other end with polyamory, there's a lot more kind of freedom with, you know, the kind of connections that you can pursue with other people. So which is not to say that you can do whatever you want. I think there's a misconception that polyamory is just like a sexual free-for-all, and that you can just, go and like have like, I don't know, 6 partners and do whatever. That's not the case. Obviously, each relationship requires personal responsibility and accountability. And in some ways, like the more relationships you create, like the more things that different commitments that you have to uphold and agreements that you have to respect. Yeah, like, the question of like, are you really autonomous is, like that's like a different question, right? But generally speaking, yeah, like you have more freedom to like just create new connections of different types with different people is what I'm trying to emphasize on the right end of the spectrum compared to the left. So going into the individual terms here. So let's look at the middle with kind of romantically exclusive but sexually non-exclusive relationships. So we have what are typically called kind of monogamish relationships. So these are relationships that are mainly monogamous, but people may have what is called like a hall pass, essentially. This might take the form of, well, if you ever met that celebrity crush and they happen to hit on you, you could totally sleep with them because or it could be like, well, if you go on a night out and you're never going to see this person again, I don't mind if you make out with them for a night. Or if you're traveling, and like kind of stuff happens, as long as you come back and it doesn't affect our relationship, it's all good with me. So relationships that are primarily monogamous, where kind of activity, sexual or romantic, like outside the relationship, is seen as the exception rather than the norm. And then kind of further to the right, we have swinging. So swinging is actually quite an outdated term these days, but there isn't really a better word to kind of describe it. So it's a term that I still use. So swinging is an activity that couples typically do together. So this is where, they go out and have recreational group sex with other couples or singles. They might go to parties, they might go to, they might like organize their own kind of threesomes, foursomes, whatever, like with other people. But mainly it's something that they do together. It's like, it's an activity that they do together for fun, and the relationships aren't supposed to be like serious. The reason why I've put like dotted lines on the spectrum rather than like hard lines is because there's a lot of there's a lot of fluidity between this. Like there are some swinger relationships, for example, where 2 couples, like they might have like a really long-standing sexual connection. They meet up very regularly, and like they might hang out as friends as well as like have fun in the bedroom. But like if they've been doing that for like 5 years, 10 years, like the relationship is going to be intimate, like no matter what. And so the boundary between like that and like a relationship where 4 people are like very kind of romantically and intimately connected, there's going to be a little bit of overlap, obviously not exactly the same, but that's why there's a dotted line. And then we have kind of like open relationships as our kind of now, like as we now define them, which is just any relationship that is like kind of sexually open, romantically closed. Like I said, the meaning of it has narrowed in recent years. And an open relationship is basically where people can go and create their own sexual connections on their own without their partner. So whereas swinging is typically something that couples do together, an open relationship is something where you and your partner can have your own kind of friends with benefits, casual connections, hookups, whatever, with other people separately, but with still like a romantic exclusive commitment to each other. And then finally, on the right, we have polyamory. So polyamory is a word that comes from like the Greek and Latin roots, meaning, well, poly meaning many, amory, amor, meaning love. And so, yeah, literally it means many love. And it is the only type of open relationship, non-monogamous relationship, where there is romantic non-exclusivity, where you're not just sexually open, but you can also pursue multiple romantic relationships. And this is where, typically like I lose a lot of people because they're like, well, I can understand having sexual feelings for other people, but how on earth do you, like fall in love with multiple people at the same time, and I'm going to get into this later on. But like this is kind of a structure of kind of mononormativity, like where, yeah, like there is this idea of your soulmate, your other half, the, you know, idea that you only get kind of one true love, and that's kind of it. You get that for the rest of your life. And obviously, like, different people like experience love and connection in different ways, but there are people who create multiple relationships, and are able to sustain those long term. And I'm going to get into kind of various misconceptions later as well. But yeah, broadly, that is the relationship spectrum. If anyone wants me to kind of clarify different things, feel free to put them in the chat. But yeah, I'm going to move on to the next slide. So this is an exercise basically to talk about how there is quite a lot of diversity even in how people define their relationships, not just non-monogamous ones, but also monogamous ones. So on this slide, you'll see like there's a bunch of different things that some people consider as cheating and some people don't. So for example, in some monogamous relationships, you're not allowed to watch porn. Any and all kind of like sexual activity, even kind of masturbation, is reserved to your partner. Whereas in other relationships, it might be like, well, yeah, I mean, you can watch porn, but maybe if you subscribe to like a specific person's OnlyFans, I may feel uncomfortable with that because that's creating a very parasocial relationship with like a very specific creator. Or, you know, someone might be like, well, yeah, I mean, you know, support sex workers, support like support, you know, like the adult industry, you can go and do that, as long as you don't like interact with people in real life. And, you know, there are some relationships where, you know, it might not be like against like the rules per se, but people be uncomfortable with, say, if you know, so, like a woman had a boyfriend and also like a very, very close male friend, or someone was still friends with their ex, or, you know, someone didn't use dating apps, but like didn't delete them. They were just still on their phone. So there are different ways that people define what is cheating, therefore what is considered commitment. And yeah, the main thing to demonstrate here is that obviously, you know, cheating looks different in non-monogamous relationships because, yeah, like rather than defining cheating as sex outside the relationship, we might define cheating as, you know, hiding a relationship or having unsafe sex and not getting tested, or, you know, having sex in the home while your partner is present but not participating. You know, this is going to be individual to the relationship. But also in monogamy, there's also a lot of, you know, discourse about what is and isn't cheating. I don't know how many of you are on TikTok, but there was a whole TikTok trend going around recently where like there was like a sound where someone was like, you know, please like just point whether it's cheating or not cheating, like with the things I'm going to say. And then she lists off a couple of things and people are like pointing at the screen going like, this is cheating, this is not cheating. And sometimes you get some couples who are doing it and they disagree. So it's really important to talk about the parameters of your relationship, no matter what style of relationship you're in. Because yeah, you would be surprised with how differently people define monogamy and, you know, how differently people define cheating, and how people want commitment to be demonstrated to them. So yeah, basically, the boundaries are a lot more blurred than you'd like to, than most people think. And even in monogamous relationships, you shouldn't be assuming that your partner is defining that monogamy the same way as you are. So this is the relationship escalator. So it's a concept that was coined by Amy Gowan, who writes a blog called solopoly.net. And essentially, the idea of the relationship escalator is that it's this societal assumption that when you get into a relationship, you have to follow a certain number of steps. And the reason why it's called the relationship escalator, as opposed to like the relationship stairs or the relationship ladder, is because when you get on an escalator, you just kind of, well, you get on, you don't move, it's unconscious, and you just go up. And it's meant to kind of demonstrate how, you know, people following the relationship escalator is almost kind of unconscious and effortless because, and unquestioned, because it's kind of what you're expected to do, is what everyone does. You know, you flirt, you get into a relationship at some point, you agree to stop seeing other people and become exclusive. You may or may not have sex, you know, like before or after, like, you know, you go exclusive, depends. Some people move in together before getting married, some people move in after, but generally that's a step that's going to happen at some point. You know, once you've become a couple, you get married, you buy a house, you have kids, you live together with a white picket fence until you die. And essentially, like the point is that you don't have to do this. You know, there are people these days who you know, get into a relationship and never get married for various reasons. There are people who you know, don't want kids. And there are people who, you know, have like asexual relationships where, yeah, sex is not going to be a main focus of their connection. There are also people who, you know, get married to their friends rather than to a romantic partner, or maybe they have a roommate that they really get along with and want to live with for the rest of their life. And they and their partners live in separate houses. So basically it's about deconstructing this idea that, like, if you're in a relationship, you have to do these things. And also how, you know, the relationship escalator as a concept, has really kind of influenced our society in really big ways, you know. And I'm going to get into next, you know, like how exactly how you know, it kind of like permeates like how the media depicts romance, and, you know, kind of like phrases that we use and that kind of thing. So yeah, relationship escalator. So here are a couple of examples of how, you know, the relationship escalator and kind of the normalization of kind of monogamy, and in some cases just, you know, like not very kind of healthy kind of relationships are depicted. So on the top left, we have The Bachelor, or its other counterpart, The Bachelorette. So I always find this show very amusing because, you know, like the whole point is that you know, you date all these people and then eventually you find the one to be exclusive with. But then throughout you get all this drama of someone like being in love with like 2 or 3 people at the same time, and they're like, oh my God, you know, why do I have to choose? And yeah, like, you know, it's very interesting for me, like as a non-monogamous person who's like, well, why do you have to choose? And so yeah, I mean, like that's been a show that's been going on for like 20 something seasons, and, you know, countries across the world. And so I think it's relevant to mention, you know, this idea that, yeah, you can't be in love with more than one person at the same time. Once you kind of lock yourself into a relationship, you're not supposed to have eyes for like anyone else. And that, you know, marriage is ultimately the end goal of a relationship. So related to marriage being the end goal of the relationship, I'm wondering kind of how many of you saw The Ultimatum on Netflix, which was, you know, really huge last year when it first aired. So I'm just going to explain the concept of The Ultimatum, the reality show, for those of you who may not be familiar, because essentially The Ultimatum is about like the people who come on the show are these couples who have been in a relationship for a period of time. And one of them really wants to get married, like ASAP. And the other one is kind of more hesitant for various reasons, or maybe isn't interested in getting married. And so the person who wants to get married issues the other an ultimatum. Basically, either you marry me, you know, within the next couple of weeks, or we, you know, move on and break up. And to kind of spice this up even further, basically these couples all appear in the show together, and they swap partners temporarily. So essentially, like the couples who want to get married ASAP, you know, they get together, and the people who aren't so sure, they also get together, and everyone lives with their new partners for 3 weeks. They then switch and live with their original partners that they came on the show with for another 3 weeks. And then at the very end, they have to decide whether they leave and marry the person that they came on the show with. They marry the new person that they've known for 3 weeks, but, you know, have like a more similar alignment with like where they want to go in their relationships, or they leave the show single. Now, for me, this was insane. Like, this was insane to me as a concept. And it made for really entertaining reality TV, but it was just really interesting to me how the media kind of like markets like marriage as the be all end all. You know, these people were so desperate to get married, and, you know, yeah, put a ring on it and kind of confirm that like the relationship was committed or whatever, that they were literally willing to burn down their entire relationship, as, you know, indeed a lot of these relationships did, you know, like for the sake of a ring on their finger. And so, yeah, basically this show was, you know, the ultimate demonstration of how like the relationship escalator has actually quite a chokehold in our society, you know, where people are like, the relationship isn't serious, the relationship isn't committed unless we are married, unless we have a ceremony, unless we kind of like merge our finances, unless we live together, etc., etc. And that really doesn't have to be the case. The main thing that I want to emphasize with this is that strong relationships of any kind, you know, monogamous, polyamorous, whatever, are ultimately based on the connection rather than the structure of the relationship. And what I mean by that is that if you use like certain markers of commitment to define like how in love you are or how serious the relationship is, you know, you're going to lose sight of ultimately like how you feel in the relationship. You know, there are plenty of people who are married or who live together or who have children who are miserable, but they're like, well, you know, we're still together, we're staying together for the kids, we you know, like ultimately like we're married, so nothing else matters. You know, love conquers all, whatever. Like, and you lock yourself into like a situation where yeah, you're relying on these markers of commitment, but there isn't actually any connection in the dynamic. And so basically we move from a framework of you need to tick these boxes in order to, you know, feel secure in the relationship. If we actually turn to our partner, were emotionally attuned with our partner, and, you know, had communication and trust and, you know, showed up for each other and that kind of thing, that's going to be way more valuable than whatever you do or don't decide to do. You know, there are like, and a really good example of this is a style of polyamory called solo polyamory. So there are different types of polyamory. Like even within the relationship spectrum, I could kind of break it down into further discrete categories, but solo polyamory is basically a style of polyamory where a person has multiple romantic connections that are, you know, not exclusive, right? But they want to live like what would be described to other people as a single lifestyle, like where, you know, they have multiple partners, but they want to live alone, or they don't want to get married, you know, and they maintain like their personal kind of independence, their personal space, but obviously they still want to pursue these like very meaningful and deep connections with people. They just don't want to share like a sock drawer or like a house in order to have to do that. And that's like a really prime example to me of connection over structure, because solo polyamorous people rely on like the connection to feel security in their relationships rather than ticking boxes of, you know, marriage and cohabitation and whatnot. And then, so, okay, back to the slide. Yeah, you know, I wanted to put kind of like Sleeping Beauty in there, and, you know, just other kind of Disney like portrayals of romantic love. I think there's a lot of discourse these days anyway about how a lot of the ideas of romance in here are just like antiquated, and you know, like for example, like Beauty and the Beast, like Belle is, you know, like falls in love with her captor. There's a little bit of like you know, kind of Stockholm syndrome going on there. Sleeping Beauty, you know, there's discourse about how you know, like Sleeping Beauty didn't consent to like the kiss of true love because, you know, she's asleep and she doesn't know what's happening. And yeah, I mean, so which is not to say this is a commentary on monogamy or anything like that. I think like Disney portrayals, like, you know, older Disney movies anyway, like their portrayal of like love and relationships doesn't match with kind of how we perceive relationships to be today. It has this very specific idea of romantic love that isn't healthy ultimately for monogamy or polyamory. And then on the right, another kind of popular piece of media, To All the Boys I've Loved Before. So this was a story about this girl who has kind of multiple crushes like throughout her life, and she's written a love letter that she never sent to each of them. But then the letters get out, and then there's drama, and she ends up having to fake a relationship. And you know, she has to make in the second movie, she has to make a choice between like the person she ended up with and another person who received a letter, and it all gets a bit messy and dramatic and entertaining. But yeah, ultimately also reinforces this idea that like there is only one, you can only pick one. You see the trope of the love triangle quite a lot in movies. And I always find it very amusing that like the two romantic options like seem like equally appealing in different ways until one of them reveals like a fatal flaw towards the end of the movie, and the protagonist is like, oh well, then I definitely have to go with the other person. And it's almost, you know, it's this thing that kind of comes in like just at the end to kind of further justify like this one choice that you make at the end, which I find very interesting. So yeah, I think basically this is to get you all to, you know, think about in your own time how relationships are depicted in the media, you know, kind of what beliefs they perpetuate and enforce, you know, good or bad, like about how we should be conducting relationships in general, and how also, you know, like how these stereotypes harm people who are not in kind of normative / kind of just monogamous relationships. So yeah, something to think about in your own time, food for thought. Ultimately, kind of, you know, what I've been saying for this presentation so far is to distance like all of these concepts that you see like on the screen from each other. Obviously, you know, they can overlap and they can be related, but not necessarily. And you know, as you'll see later, there are misconceptions, you know, in the media, in the news, etc., that are perpetuated because of the belief that you know, if you are not in a monogamous relationship, you're not really in love with each other, or that if you don't put a ring on it, then your relationship doesn't mean anything, or that, you know, you need marriage in order to prove commitment in a relationship, or that once you're married, you're going to be happy forever and ever. Or even that, you know, if you have to be in love, you know, in romantic love in order to get married, or in order to demonstrate kind of commitment. So all of these things, you know, they don't have to mean the same thing. And yeah, like, so it's about kind of like questioning the idea of like, you know, romantic love being kind of held like in such high regard as a concept in our society, as well as, you know, the idea of like the exclusive, like one true love. And, you know, while you may choose monogamy like for yourself because it's the relationship style that feels most comfortable for you, I think the thing to emphasize here is that you don't have to. And as with, you know, other things as well, like, you know, it's much better to like question and explore that aspect of your identity and think about your desires, than to go in blindly and do what everyone else is doing. I would say that for gender as well. It's good to come to go through like a phase of, you know, exploring your gender identity or exploring your sexuality. And even at the end of that journey, you're like, nah, you know, I think I'm cis, I think I'm straight. You will probably have learned more about yourself, that, and, you know, feel more confident in your identity than you would if, you know, you had never done that questioning in the first place. And so just like I encourage everyone to, you know, explore and be curious and question, you know, their sexuality and their gender identity and the way they live their lives, I also encourage you to question, you know, how you want to run your relationships, how you want your friendships to look, what kind of activities you want to do with your friends, as well as kind of with your lovers, how many relationships you want to have, how often you want to see these people, what kind of commitments do you want to make to a romantic partner or friends or not, right? Yeah, you know, there is a societal idea of what you should be doing, but it's okay to break outside of that if that is something that you feel would make you and your partner or partners and friends happier or more fulfilled. So yeah, moving on. So I've talked about the relationship escalator and how, you know, it's reinforced, you know, in our society as this thing that you need to do. And, you know, on the flip side of that, well, I suppose not on the flip side of that, but as a related concept to that, is something called relationship anarchy. So relationship anarchy is a concept that I think was coined by Andy Nordgren in around the 2010s, I think in the early 2010s. She came up with this manifesto that's published in the anarchist library. You can look it up online. It's very, very short. Like, it will literally take you like 5 minutes to read. The Relationship Anarchy Manifesto. And it's basically applying the political principles of anarchy to relationships. There are 10 principles. I won't go through all of them in turn. But the idea of relationship anarchy is to, like I said at the start of the presentation, customize your commitments, customize your connections. So instead of assuming that, you have to follow the relationship escalator and that, your romantic partner is like the partner that you should prioritize above all others, it encourages you to, prioritize your relationships or design your relationships according to what you actually want. And so, not assuming immediate hierarchies, not assuming that, these conventions, you can do whatever you want. So, you might have you might, for example, run a business with your partner. That's a very common thing that people do. You might get married and raise children with a friend. You might have a marriage where, obviously you have financial legal ties to each other because of the marriage, but and you have a romantic connection, but you don't have a sexual one. Perhaps you pursue kind of sexual relationships with other people instead. You may or may not choose to raise children with friends or with partners. You may consider some of your friends a life partnership rather than just your romantic partner. And you may have creative pursuits, with friends or partners, kind of whatever you want, basically. Or you may want to have those pursuits with one partner, but not with another. Essentially, like, instead of seeing like all these things in kind of discrete boxes of like, oh, this is a thing that friends do, this is a thing that kind of sexual partners do, and this is a thing that romantic partners do, I encourage more fluidity, like, across all of these. And also the question, what is the line between what is romantic and what is platonic? Is it vibes? Is it the kind of feeling that you get in your chest? Is it what you do with each other? Is it the responsibilities that you have with each other that make the difference? I think different people are going to define that in different ways, but it's important to think about for sure. And yeah, like, instead of like seeing them all in kind of discrete categories, to be able to kind of pick and choose and have all of these, on an equal plane, of just commitments that you uphold to each other, right? And that these can change at different times of life. So, for example, like, someone might be a really good romantic and sexual partner, but maybe you're domestically incompatible, right? Depending on how you want to kind of like use your home, right? One person might be very extroverted, for example, and be like, I want to use the home as a social hub. I want to have people over all the time. I want to host friends, and have sleepovers, and have like lots of like big parties. And your partner, while they might share like a very deep and intense romantic and sexual connection with you, they'll be like, that sounds like my idea of hell. I want the home to be a refuge. I want the home to be a sanctuary away from other people because I'm an introvert and I want to recharge. And so, if these two people like live together and they couldn't find a way to kind of compromise on that, that would be a disaster. And they might end up breaking off a relationship that would have otherwise survived if they realized, yeah, we're not domestically compatible, we shouldn't live together. And we might be able to sustain a relationship where we lived apart rather than force the situation and then have everything blow up in our faces. So that's just like one example, but you can see how like this works in like other aspects of connections with like friends and partners as well. So and another aspect of relationship anarchy, apart from like don't assume that like this type of relationship comes with these conditions, is also to question like the hierarchy of your one true romantic partner and then everyone else. You see these you've probably every one of you like probably has that friend, or maybe you have been that friend who got into a relationship and then promptly forgot about everyone else, because you want to spend all your time with your partner, and you know, like every waking moment is spent with your partner, and then you start neglecting your friends, or you know, you stop hanging out with some people in case your partner gets jealous, etc., etc. And then maybe the relationship ends and you're like, oh, you know, wait, you know, like, who do I lean on for support now? And you know, the prioritization of like the romantic partner, at, you know, at the expense of all your other connections, that can be a very dangerous thing, because ultimately we all need connection, we all need support, and it's good to get support from a wide variety of sources rather than isolating it with one person, because that also puts a lot of pressure on your partner. It also puts a lot of expectations on them that they may not be able to fulfill, or that they feel guilt and shame about not being able to fulfill. In polyamory, there's this whole thing about how a partner is not able to meet like all of your needs. And you know, like while polyamory is specifically talking about like multiple different relationships, like, you know, romantic relationships where you might be able to like get this need met with someone else, or pursue this hobby with this other partner that your other partner doesn't like, or whatever. I think it also applies more generally to like all types of relationships where yeah, you can do different things with different people. Your partner doesn't have to share the same interests that you do. They don't have to do the same things as you all the time. They don't have to go with you to all the social events that you want to go to. And it's okay to maintain like some level of independence, you know, even in the relationship, because it's all the sweeter when you come back together. And so, yeah, you know, like this whole thing about like expectations that you place on your partner is basically like a roundabout way of saying, you know, don't put all your eggs in one basket. And I don't mean like, you know, romantic partners speaking. I just mean with people in general. Have like have a variety of friendships, have a variety of connections with others, have a variety of like hobbies and pursuits that you share with some people but not others. And you know, while you may even if you want a monogamous relationship where, you know, you want one person to fulfill all of your sexual and romantic needs, be very careful to kind of balance that, you know, balance that out in other ways with other people. So you don't kind of fall into the trap of becoming like overly enmeshed. So there's a speaker that I really admire. Her name is Esther Perel, and she's a Belgian psychotherapist, and she's been talking about like relationships for like literally decades. She's got a couple of TED Talks on YouTube that are really interesting, and they talk about, and her work primarily focuses on desire, the concept of desire, in long-term relationships, especially because typically in long-term relationships, desire and passion starts to wane a bit after a certain period of time, especially if you move in together, especially if you start having kids. And she talks about how to kind of keep that spark alive and kind of what creates desire in relationships. She also talks about infidelity. She also talks about cheating and how people repair from cheating and why people cheat. And why it is such a common phenomenon in monogamous relationships. And I think her work is really interesting and worth checking out, because she talks about this idea of, you know, to maintain desire in a relationship, you have to, you know, kind of be together but also apart at the same time, because in relationships there's these kind of competing needs for, you know, security and connection and safety, but also, you know, excitement and freedom and novelty and variety. And these things, you know, they contradict each other. They may not, like, you know, it's very difficult to have them at all times in the same person. And so how are you going to create that kind of distance? Because desire is about wanting something that you don't have yet. So if you already have someone, so to speak, you know, how are you going to desire them if you're already, you know, if you're already enmeshed? And so that's why there's this encouragement of, you know, like together, but, you know, with some like independence, you know, to pursue other things to kind of keep things interesting. Anyway, yeah, so that was a bit of a tangent, but basically I think it's really worth checking out her work, because even though she talks about monogamous relationships, I think she advocates for like a very expansive kind of you know, vision of monogamous relationships that I think is very, you know, universally applicable to everyone really. So yeah, relationship anarchy, you know, just if you're interested in your own time, look up the Relationship Anarchy Manifesto. It's free, like on the Anarchist Library. It's like it's like 10 principles. It's not very long. And yeah, have a look through the principles, because it's really interesting and applicable to all types of relationships. So we're getting to now to kind of misconceptions about non-monogamy. There are a whole bunch of misconceptions that I probably won't have the time to get into today. And I mean, if you're interested, I have an FAQ in my website. I'm just going to link it in the chat now. Where, who was that author who wrote about infidelity? Esther Perel. So she wrote a book called The State of Affairs. Very clever title, I think, The State of Affairs, which is about infidelity and why people cheat, and also, you know, how to repair from cheating, and like the kind of this like psychology of the person who cheated, the person who's been cheated on, and also the third person that they cheated with. I think it's very fascinating, and also like a very non-judgmental view of, you know, what is something that happens a lot, you know. So yeah, Esther Perel's work is worth checking out, but she's probably more famous for her book Mating in Captivity. So I'm just going to put in the chat now. Her two books are Mating in Captivity and The State of Affairs. There we go. And just also Andy Nordgren is the person who wrote the Relationship Anarchy Manifesto. Let me put that in the chat as well. There we go. So yeah, so I have an FAQ on my website where I basically compiled like all the things that various people on the internet have said to me over the years about being polyamorous and non-monogamous. And so I've dispelled quite a lot of misconceptions in my content already, but today I wanted to focus on kind of not just the misconceptions themselves, but also you know, what beliefs they are rooted in. So I've made this table here. Just to explain a bit of time. So mononormative is basically, yeah, like the norm, like the fact that monogamy is the norm and the normalization of monogamy. And the noun to describe it is like mononormativity. So the phenomenon of, you know, monogamy being normalized in society, you know, on a structural level, on a kind of infrastructural legal like level. I'm going to get into that later as well. And kind of related to mononormativity is amatonormativity. So this is a term that is more commonly used in the asexual and aromantic communities. And you'd be surprised at how much of an overlap there is between like ace and aro communities and polyamorous communities. You might think that they're completely opposed, but they're actually not, because both communities, you know, really question how relationships are run, right? Like asexual people challenge the idea that sex is core to a romantic relationship, and that, you know, without sex in a relationship, you're just friends or something. And aromantic people question the idea of romance. You know, what is romance? What is romanticism? And like, how do you form like deep connections with people without romance? You know, it challenges the idea of platonic love being less than you know, like romantic connection. And so it's very interesting kind of like looking at the parallels between like what's being described in the ace and aro community and the polyamorous community, because yeah, they're all kind of fighting the same things about like, you know, how relationships look. And yeah, so amatonormativity is just, yeah, like the normalization of like romantic love, particularly the prioritization of romantic love above everyone else. Yeah, you know, and there's a lot of overlap between that and mononormativity, right? Because like love equals monogamy in our society. And so yeah, so that's why I kind of put the two concepts together here, because I think there's a lot of overlap between the two. So all right, so the first thing, something that I hear quite a lot on my page is polyamorous people are afraid of commitment. Polyamorous or non-monogamous people are people who are afraid of commitment. I've also had a lot of followers write into me about how they are pathologized by not just family, but also medical professionals, by therapists. You know, I've had clients who were like diagnosed with you know, BPD or like narcissism because of their desire to be polyamorous, and they ended up having to switch therapists because, you know, their therapist couldn't, you know, get it out of their heads that, well, maybe the problem, you know, wasn't that they didn't want monogamy, but something else entirely. And so this idea of like being afraid of commitment is rooted in the idea that commitment looks like a certain type of relationship. So like I said before, you know, like with the slide where, you know, love doesn't equal monogamy, doesn't equal marriage, etc. Yeah, like commitment can look like whatever you want it to be. And you know, in my opinion anyway, to me, if a person is committed to me, that's someone who celebrates my wins, who supports me when I'm sad, who you know, yeah, like you know, kind of like is encouraging of my achievements, who, you know, loves and respects and communicates with me and trusts me. And none of these things have to come with exclusivity or marriage, or the idea of, you know, forsaking all others. You know, someone can do all of those things for me and also see other people if they wanted to, as long as they uphold the agreements in our relationship. Absolutely no problem what they're doing with other people. So yeah, you know, the like polyamorous people commit to others in a very specific way, but you know, just because the commitment looks a little bit different doesn't mean that it's not there. And so, you know, it's interesting to look at this and think about, like, what does commitment mean to you, right? Is it an act? Is it a feeling? Is it like a step? And how do you sustain it over time, right? Because I think people don't question this enough. I mean, like I said, people don't question relationships enough. They don't question what is cheating. They don't question the boundaries in their relationship enough. And yeah, the concept of commitment is a lot more fluid than people think. So yeah, so this is a misconception that I just want to highlight because I think it's interesting to bring up. So the next one, non-monogamous people are at higher risk of contracting STIs. So, you know, if you're looking at this from like a purely objective and like a logical level, well, you know, non-monogamous people have more sexual partners. Monogamous people typically are supposed to have one sexual partner, possibly for life. So yeah, you know, you're going to have more sex with more people, you know, and if those people have STIs, then, you know, that might kind of transmit like across networks. But in real life, people don't actually work that way. In 2015, there was a study conducted by Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I've forgotten the name of the study because it's quite long, but I'm going to put the year and the name of the academic who conducted the study in the chat, so you can look this up yourself. Basically, he conducted a study where he interviewed different participants who were monogamous or non-monogamous, and then analyzed their sexual habits, and then also, you know, like how often they'd contracted an STI. And he actually found that there was zero correlation between relationship style and likelihood of contracting an STI. There are a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, people who are non-monogamous, because of the whole kind of just cultural thing where if you're non-monogamous, you know, the whole point is like you're honest with your partners, you communicate with your partners, you know, you trust them, you have like very specific agreements that you very specifically negotiate in a way that you might not in a monogamous relationship. And because of these very specific agreements, like non-monogamous people talk about like sexual responsibility quite a lot more, because you have the responsibility of multiple partners, you have the responsibility to keep them safe, keep yourself safe. And so because of that, like non-monogamous people, this guy found, were generally more likely to get tested, to communicate with their partners about the amount of sex that they were having with other people, to disclose to their partners if they did contract an STI, so then it wouldn't spread to them and they might abstain for a little bit until they took some antibiotics and, you know, got it cured or whatever. And so, you know, there's like a lot more honesty and communication across networks, meaning that even if there was an STI outbreak, like, you know, it wouldn't spread because they'd be honest about it happening and, you know, like communicate accordingly. So that's kind of one reason why, even though a non-monogamous person may have more sexual partners, the risk is tempered by the kind of responsibility that they take because of the sex that they're having and the conversations that they're having with other people. But also, more importantly, of the monogamous people that he surveyed, a lot of them cheated, because cheating happens quite a lot in monogamy. You know, the statistics range from like 25% of people cheat to like, in some cases, 75% of people cheat. Obviously, this kind of thing is very difficult to measure because, well, you have to get people to admit to cheating in the first place. And also there's a you know, that like I said, people define cheating in different ways, right? Like like if you have like a very intense emotional connection with someone but you never act on it, is that cheating? You know, some people would say yes, some people would say no. So cheating as a phenomenon is very difficult to measure. But yeah, studies range, but you know, the consensus is that cheating happens. So not only do monogamous people cheat and therefore, you know, covertly have multiple partners, but they're also less likely to do it safely. You know, it was found that, I think, you'll have to double check the study on this, but I think like 25% of the people in monogamous relationships cheated, and when they cheated, they were less likely to be using a condom, be practicing safer sex, and they were less likely to disclose to their partners if they contracted an STI, and therefore gave their partners an STI. So, you know, this is like on a practical level, like how things actually worked. You know, if in an ideal reality where monogamous people are actually monogamous 100% of the time, yeah, then sure, fine, non-monogamous people would be at a higher risk of STIs, but that's not the reality. That's not actually what happens. And you know, there's also with that, you know, the assumption that kind of polyamorous and non-monogamous people, like their sole focus is sex, which it isn't necessarily. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but in polyamorous relationships, typically the focus is on, you know, love, connection, commitment, intimacy, well, you know, romance, you know, rather than like having lots of wild sex and orgies all the time. And yeah, so there are certain assumptions made of people who are non-monogamous. A lot of people assume, you know, it's the same as being single, it's the same as being irresponsible, as the same as being, you know, very kind of sexually promiscuous. That isn't necessarily the case. You can have multiple partners, but you know, you might have been together for a very long time. Maybe none of you actually have sex with other people anymore. You're just in this pod. So the risk is going to be like a little bit lower. So yeah, so that's a really interesting study that I like to bring up whenever people are like, you know, you're going to die of AIDS someday. And, you know, I bring up this study because, yeah, like it really shows that monogamous people are not as good at monogamy as, unfortunately, we like to think they are. So third thing kind of related to this is that it's people think it's impossible to cheat in an open relationship. So, you know, as I have explained on the previous slide, cheating doesn't just look like one thing. It can be different depending on the relationship, even in monogamous relationships. And so, you know, just because non-monogamous people have like, you know, like have sexual non-exclusivity, it doesn't mean it's a free-for-all. It doesn't mean that you can just, you know, do whatever you want without regard for people around you and without regard for your community. And there has to be kind of care and consideration and factoring in people's feelings and stuff, like whenever you do anything. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a kind of very, very simple explanation. Cheating doesn't doesn't just look like one thing. It looks like a bunch of different things. So it is possible to cheat in an open relationship, but you know, what that looks like is going to have to depend on the people in the relationship. And that applies to monogamous people as well. And then finally, I think the most interesting thing is this misconception that in a polyamorous network, everyone dates each other. So yeah, like if one person is dating two people, those people also have to be dating for it to be polyamorous. Not the case. Absolutely not the case. Not just because like different people have different sexualities, but also because different people have different types. So a bit about me. I have two boyfriends. One is straight, one is bisexual. The straight guy is obviously not into the bisexual guy because he's not into guys. But even if they were both bisexual, they might not be into each other because they might not be each other's type. So, you know, you can see how that already kind of falls apart on a logistical level. But I think it's worth examining where this misconception comes from. Because like I said in previous slides, right, you know, this idea of the soulmate, your other half, right, you know, old ball and chain, this idea that once you get into a relationship, the two of you are almost like fused together into like one person, or maybe not one person, but like, you know, a single unit. You do everything together, you have the same friends, you have the same social networks, you have the same interests, etc. You live together, you get married, etc. Right? And so it's very interesting how this has been applied to non-monogamous relationships as well. It's like, well, okay, you have more people, but all of you are a single fused unit, right? And you see this in the media where even though there is quite a lot of variety in the way that non-monogamous relationships are conducted, in the media, in the news, in kind of popular kind of TV portrayals of polyamory, it is always triads. So a triad is like three people in a relation, a throuple, where three people are all dating each other. So A is dating B, B is dating C, C is dating A. You see this as like the dominant kind of portrayal of non-monogamous people in the media. And I think it's because it's the structure that is closest to monogamy without actually being monogamy. Because it's like three people, they're all dating each other, they're all a single unit. And it's like a couple, but there's three of them. And I find that so interesting. Because yeah, like it not only kind of perpetuates this idea that like, yeah, like non-monogamy is just monogamy, but with more people, but also that there is this fusion of identity, within networks, and this discouragement of kind of like, individual identity and kind of, more independence, like in the relationship. And also related to this, related to the idea of like triads and thruples being like the main thing that you see in the media. You also typically see structures where it's two bi women and one straight man. You very rarely see configurations in the media that are like two bi men and one straight woman, or three gay guys, or three lesbians, or three non-binary people. And I think again, that's also a way of like being palatable to mainstream media. It's like, okay, this idea that men are more sexually promiscuous and have like more voracious kind of sexual appetites than women, and therefore they get to have multiple partners. Women are more sexually conservative, women are more demure, whatever. These conceptions, right, mean that a triad where there's two women and one man, and the two women are bisexual, is like the dominant portrayal of non-monogamous people in the media, even though they actually, in reality, thruples and triads make up a very small percentage of the non-monogamous community. And so, yeah, like the beliefs that it perpetuates, I think it's really interesting to think about that, and to think about like, yeah, why triads? Why is it the ones with multiple women? It perpetuates the man, like, like having multiple partners, and that being kind of more socially acceptable than a woman having multiple partners. But also, the sexualization, the eroticization, I would even say the commodification of female sexuality, of queer female sexuality, of, it's like, oh yeah, there's lesbians, but they're also dating the guy, hot. You'll see this in the media where like the relationship between the women is like very overly sexualized, like compared to their relationship with the man. And even in some cases, how like their relationship like serves the man, I think that's really interesting. So there's obviously some examples in more recent years, like which break that stereotype. A really interesting example that I totally would not have expected, on my bingo card like 2 years ago, is Gossip Girl. So Gossip Girl did a reboot in 2021. And in the first season, there is a triad with two bisexual men and one straight woman. Well, I think she's straight anyway. But two men and one woman. Still a triad. But bisexual men are not very like positively represented in the media, or even represented at all in the media usually. And so to see not just one but two of them was really encouraging. And I think eventually I hope that we move from a point where instead of just FFM triads, moving to like not just like more different configurations of triads, but also other configurations entirely. I mean, season 2 of Gossip Girl was a little bit more disappointing, but season 1 was really good. But that's a whole other topic. I can talk about media representation of polyamory, as a whole other separate talk. But yeah, you can go to my Instagram for that kind of commentary. Anyway, so I think kind of like what I want to demonstrate with these 4 examples, these 4 misconceptions, is all these beliefs come from somewhere. And if you go through my FAQ, if you go through kind of the things that people have said at me, at other non-monogamous people, think about like, where does that come from? Like, what do they believe that they think that? And what does that say about our society, right? That this is the dominant belief about how relationships should look. More food for thought. So now kind of moving on to the third section, which is like your social stigma and legal challenges. So yeah, I mean, non-monogamous people are getting more and more recognition, not just in the US, but across the world. And currently, there are multiple US states, I think California, Washington, Louisiana, and Rhode Island. They have explicitly recognized families with multiple parents. So this doesn't just include like polyamorous people, but also, you know, step families, like, you know, adoptive families. Yeah, so you know, like, I want to emphasize that like marriage rights and just kind of recognition of multi-parent families and stuff like that doesn't just apply to polyamorous people. Because yeah, like we already have networks with multi-parent families, you know, blended families, rainbow families, you know, like families like where yeah, you know, where people from different marriages come together, or, you know, multi-generational families, right? Like, you know, as an Asian person, like in Asian culture, it's very common for children to be raised not just by their parents, but also the extended family, their grandparents, aunts, uncles, etc., in community. So we already have like examples of children being raised by multiple parents, but for some reason everyone loses their minds if everyone is romantically involved for some reason. So anyway, kind of social stigma and legal challenges, right? There was also the Uniform Parentage Act, which I can't remember when that was established, but it allows for the legal recognition of more than two parents. In 2020, which was actually a couple of months before I started my page, the city of Somerville, they passed an ordinance that allowed for more than two domestic partnerships. And also, you know, in other parts of the world, in the Supreme Court in Newfoundland, they recognize the parental responsibilities of a three-parent family. And also, I think earlier this month, in Colombia, there was a triad that formalized three-way marriage in Colombia, and more importantly, they changed pension laws after death of a live-in partner. So this is a really interesting thing. In Colombia, if someone dies and they have a pension fund where, you know, like survivors of like the deceased can like claim the benefits, right? In pension law in Colombia currently, like who can claim the benefits are a live-in partner and a lover who doesn't live with the deceased. So, you know, basically accounting for the married widow and the secret lover who lived somewhere else. So these two people can claim like survivor benefits from a pension fund, but it doesn't account for two or more people who were openly partners who lived with the person who died. I found that fascinating. Like, you know, the like it's literally baked into the law that, yeah, like your secret lover, you know, the person that you were cheating on your wife with or whatever, they can claim the survivor benefits, but not someone who was in an open polyamorous relationship with you. That was truly wild to me. But anyway, they changed that law, right, very recently. There was, yeah, so this gay triad of three men, actually four men, but anyway, like they like fought for kind of like their rights to kind of claim like survivor benefits after one of the members in their network died of cancer. And yeah, so they managed to claim it not just for you know, like the longest lasting partner, but also the second partner who had been living with them for over 5 years, I think 10 years even. I can't remember the exact length of time. It was a very, very interesting case. And so, yeah, like you see these things that are baked into the law that recognize, but don't recognize like an open and kind of, you know, open and honest kind of polyamorous network. Yeah, so that was wild to me. And I think it was really interesting that, like, yeah, that move was made where people were like, oh, yeah, you know, you can have multiple partners that live with you in a home. What a wild concept. So but yeah, you know, kind of broadly talking about kind of like social stigma Obviously, I've already covered a number of misconceptions. And yeah, you know, these misconceptions don't exist in a vacuum, right? They are influenced by kind of the media. They're influenced by, you know, how, you know, kind of like marriage is, you know, encouraged in society. You know, there's this whole structure, right? And that inevitably like affects like certain groups. So like I said, you know, with like the pension kind of survivor benefits, or with, you know, kind of like marriage rights, you know, if one person has a married partner and then they have another partner, you know, like what rights do they have if like something happens to one of their partners, someone dies, or you know, like they break up and, you know, they share a house, right? Hospital visits, you know, typically it's like the spouse or like immediate family who are allowed to visit in the hospital, but what about, you know, partners that you're not married to? In the workplace, discrimination against people based on like race or gender identity or sexuality obviously is kind of being codified into law a lot more. But what about having multiple partners? Particularly because studies have shown, you know, they did a study where basically they had like a bunch of random sentences where, like, I don't know, John and Sarah are in a monogamous marriage and have 2 children. John does this at work. And then, you know, they asked like the people to rate to like out of 5, you know, certain characteristics of like, how responsible do you think this person is? You know, how trustworthy do you think this person is? And they would interview some, they surveyed some other people, and they changed nothing about the paragraph except John and Sarah in an open marriage instead of a monogamous marriage. And then suddenly they're they were suddenly perceived as less moral, less stable, less capable to care for people, less trustworthy. So this social stigma contributes to, you know, negative perceptions of polyamorous people in, you know, all aspects of life. I have followers who've written into me about how they only got a promotion after they broke up with their like their you know, their second partner. You know, how like they were being passed over for opportunities at work because they were openly polyamorous. You know, and obviously these things are very difficult to prove, just like, you know, if you're queer and, you know, or you're black or you're trans and you have opportunities at work pass over, and you're like, well, is it because of my ability or is it because of like my identity and discrimination? But there's clearly a correlation here. You know, with like with death, like I said, with hospital visits, with marriage, with in the workplace, with child custody arrangements. The number of people who have told me about how their parents or, you know, friends called CPS on their family because once they found out that they were in a polyamorous relationship, and were like, oh my God, think of the children, tried to have their children taken away from them, is shocking. So, you know, basically, yeah, none of this exists in a vacuum. Like the misconceptions are informed by, you know, like this like mononormativity, which further perpetuate mononormativity, and we end up in this vicious cycle. And also marriage rights, they don't just affect non-monogamous people. They also affect disabled people. In the US, I can't remember which states this applies to, and I'm in the UK, so like forgive me for not knowing the ins and outs of this, but in some states, people, or like disabled people who are on benefits, can lose their benefits if they get married, because it's like, well, now you're married, you have someone to look after you, we're going to cut like 25% of the money that you were going to receive, which disincentivizes them from getting married. How does that affect their relationships? How does that affect their kind of, you know, stability, not just romantically, but also financially? So okay, someone said, yeah, that's true in California. Wild, right? So yeah, you know, like these things don't just affect non-monogamous people, but also single people, or people who have disabilities, or just people who are marginalized in multiple ways, right? We have to think about this from an intersectional lens as well. And so, yeah, you know, that's why it's important to kind of talk about like the impact that legal marriage has had on society, the impact of, you know, kind of like custody arrangements or whatever, and how like certain stereotypes about certain types of relationships or genders or whatever, like have on, you know, like how to raise children and that kind of thing. Yeah, someone also said it also makes it hard to get out of an abusive marriage if you're disabled. That's true as well. Yeah, so, you know, think about this from kind of the perspective of like multiple marginalizations. And I do think that part of the reason why non-monogamous people are, you know, like, if not discriminated against, at least marginalized, is also partly due to the fact that non-monogamy and queerness like overlap quite a lot, right? You know, like obviously they're not the same thing, but they are kind of related to each other, and non-monogamy has been like a very kind of queer adjacent practice, particularly in gay male communities, for literally decades. So yeah, you know, like it's interesting to think about these things, and it's very important, I feel. So that's it, basically. You know, so just to recap, we've talked about the relationship structures. We talked about you know, the concept of the relationship escalator. We talked about relationship anarchy as a concept for kind of you know, not prioritizing certain relationships over others, and not immediately assuming certain relationships come with certain conditions. We talked about how misconceptions are informed by various beliefs about relationships in society. We've also talked about how this, you know, affects people in a practical way, you know, not just polyamorous people, but also, yeah, like single people, you know, like, and how people who are not married are literally economically punished, because, yeah, you can't get insurance or health benefits or like a house or like whatever, right? How we get all incentivized to be in a monogamous married couple, and how that influences people who don't want to do that. So yeah, hope this presentation has helped inform you know, you all a bit on how yeah, like how, you know, relationships can be more than just kind of monogamy, and how certain things don't like commitment can look like a bunch of different ways. Your friendships can look like a bunch of different ways, and how mononormativity has a chokehold on us all.